Mark chapter 8, I do have scripture to read, and I think it's pertinent to what I want to talk about. And if you didn't see the screen, it says deconstruction. That's, you can leave the scripture up now. But the sermon is deconstructing, and next week is reconstructing your faith. And faith, as defined last week, it's that friendship with God, that relationship that has to go through trial before it becomes really sincere, like any other friendship in life. So with that in mind, I want to read a story that I think pertains. Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. And I'm only going to read a few verses, just one little story in the Gospel of Mark. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. That's Jesus, of course. So he took the blind man by the hand, and he led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. The word of the Lord, the gospel according to Mark. I love that story, partly because I am severely nearsighted. Well, I was. I had PRK surgery during COVID, and now I can see 20/20. But before that, I was essentially legally blind. Anyone else have a driver's license with a little caveat that says must wear corrective lenses? Yeah, mine was very severe. Anyone who wears contacts, I was negative 14 and a half. So most places don't carry that size. I have to wait a month to special order them. I had really bad vision. So if I took my contacts out or my glasses off, anyone, even 5 or 10 feet away, looked like a walking tree. I get this. And it was frustrating. And I thought about what it would have been like to try to drive a car without glasses. I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't see the steering wheel, let alone the cars in front of me. It was really, really bad. And so maybe that's why I love this story, because I was technically a blind man before the invention of glasses. Thankfully, I lived after the invention of glasses. I also think I like the story because it's one of the only times I can think of, maybe the only time, that Jesus had to touch someone twice for them to be completely healed. My kids, they love to build stuff with magnets, and kind of like Legos, but they're magnet tiles, Picasso tiles. Anybody else have those in their house? They're pretty neat. They're really neat. And anyway, my kids build towers as high as they can get them. They make castles and all kinds of cool stuff. And inevitably, either the dog or their siblings will knock it over. And they love that, as you can imagine. So then I hear, Dad, there's someone knocked over. And then I have to console them and say, it's okay. You can just build it again. Whatever you did before, you should remember what you did, right? And they'll say, I don't remember what I made. And I'll say, well, you learned from it, and now you can make something even better. And that doesn't work too well, but in my brain it makes sense, but they don't get it. But I was thinking about that because it happened a couple days ago. Mirabelle built this tall tower, and immediately Hudson knocked it down. Like as soon as he walked in the room. And he didn't do it on purpose. He just ran into it. And Mirabelle started tearing up, and she said, it was taller than me, and it took so long to build. And I said, it's okay. You can build another one. And then I had this preacher dad moment where I said, isn't that a lot like what God does for us? And she said, bye, and went in the other room. I think I'll play with Barbies instead. But it's true. If you were to read Scripture, that's the story of the Bible. It's order out of disorder, rather out of chaos. There's order in the beginning. Then it's disordered, and then it's reordered, and that's the end of the story. I mean, we're talking meta narrative, right? The big picture of the Bible is out of chaos, God brings order, then we disorder it, and then God reorders it and allows us to be part of that process. That's the big picture. And I think that's important because part of the story of the Bible is a story of disordering and reordering. It's a story of deconstructing and reconstructing. And I would imagine our lives as Christians would be microcosms of that bigger story, that we would be people who are disordered and reordered. That makes sense to me. And so I look for that in the Bible, and I look for it in my life, and I see it. And so when I talk about deconstruction, quick caveat, I'm talking about untangling or decluttering your own faith as a Christian. I'm not talking about Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault or these French philosophers in the last 100 years who taught deconstructionism. Now, some of deconstructionism applies, but if you don't know what any of that is, then ignore what I'm saying. But for those who did study that in school or know what I'm talking about, deconstructionism is a questioning of power structures. And it's what's led to a lot of critical theory today about how people gain power over other people and, forms of supremacy and corruption and things like that. The abuse of money, the abuse of power. All of that's important in social construct to examine. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about simply taking the Bible and deconstructing the text and saying, look at how patriarchal guys in the ancient Near East controlled everybody else, slaves and women and children and even slaughtered animals. That's one way to look at the Bible, and people do that. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a much bigger picture of more ancient practice. That is to examine your own beliefs for yourself. And I think that sounds like something commonsensical people should do. Is commonsensical a word? It is now. People with common sense. I think it's in fact something that people have done for a long time. If you think about the Reformation 500 years ago, which you don't often think about, but someone like me, I think about it a lot. And the Reformation was really the process of deconstructing the present condition of the Catholic faith, the Western Church. People rose up in the church and said, what we have now isn't working, something about it isn't right, many things about it are not right, and we need to take it apart and reassemble it. And they created a clause, semper reformanda in Latin, and it means always reforming. The problem with the Reformation is they stopped reforming, pretty quickly in fact, and each group branched off and they stopped where they were and said, we like it now. This is good. And they did the same thing everyone before them was guilty of. They didn't keep reforming. They didn't continue to deconstruct and reconstruct. They just took a few things that they didn't like and threw it out, and they left it out. And that's why today we have so many problems between Catholics and Protestants, because both sides have gone to extremes in opposition rather than taking healthy approaches to find commonality and to find Christ in the center. Anyway, I think right now the word deconstruction is popular, and it's also sort of associated with villainy in churches, especially those that identify as evangelical. Now, we're not technically evangelical. We are just truly non-denominational. But most of you in here would probably say you are evangelicals, and I know many of you vote as evangelicals in the voting polls. And so that title is appropriate for many of you. With that in mind, I wanted to share with you a quote. This or not a quote, but a statistic. I think it's interesting. 8% of millennials, so people in my age bracket, those who grew up in the church, so we're only talking about millennials who grew up in the church, 8% still affirm the crucifixion, resurrection, and divinity of Jesus and still attend church at least once a month. 8% of people in my age group that grew up in the church, not all people my age, just the ones that grew up in the church, 8% of them still believe in the crucifixion, resurrection, and divinity of Jesus and attend once a month or more. So think about that. They have a name for some of us in that age bracket. Resilient disciples. Resilient disciples. Which I think is odd. That literally just believing the bare orthodox essentials of the Christian faith and attending church once a month makes you resilient. That troubles me when I read statistics like that. Just by remaining generally Christian. And other Western countries have very similar statistics. In fact, the only places that have better numbers are in Asia and Africa, pretty much. So at least in the Western world, in the US and Europe and Canada, we're looking at similar statistics. Maybe 5 to 10% of people my age that grew up in church still go to church and still believe some of those basic essential truths. Why? We have to ask why, unless you don't care. So there are some people who think, just let me live and die and pay my taxes and go in peace. But those of us who care about the health of the church, for those of us who care about extending the kingdom of God, for those of us who take our faith seriously and not selfishly, we have to ask why. Why is that happening? And the immediate answer is secularization, but then who's to blame for that? It's like a really good murder mystery where it's everyone there played some part in it, right? By the end of it, you're like, actually, it was like 5 or 6 people that had their hand in these murders, which I love those murder mysteries. I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes. That's probably part of what's wrong with me. So let me give you some examples. When I say secularization, I'm talking about the sort of Christian civil war where Christians are fighting with one another and with the world around us about what's right or wrong and true and untrue and education and all of that. So I thought of a few reasons this might be happening. Here are some of those guilty parties: Darwinism, existentialism, postmodernism, whatever that actually is, the sexual revolution. Some of you lived through that in the 60s. And some of you know how serious the impact was of the 1960s in this country. The exposing of religious corruption. I'm thinking large scale, like the Catholic Church went through that huge spell of distrust when many priests were found. But it's happening all the time in other Protestant churches. Many of them you never hear about because they're not big enough to be on the news. But religious leaders who are corrupt and they become exposed. Political vitriol. I know that doesn't affect Gallia County, but some people do get angry about politics and religion. And that was a joke. Well, it wasn't a joke, it was just sarcasm, and I've got to work on it. One of the things I'm working on is being less sarcastic. And then internet. I think this is my last point, but I think it's the strongest. The internet and information. The reason that we can be the way we are today is because we have crazy access to information, especially through the internet. And there are people who are afraid of the internet and microchips and everything else. And, that's fine. But I'm not, and I see in many ways that it's saving the church because it's bringing those who really love Jesus together in ways that they weren't before. And it's reminding those who don't really care about Jesus and just want the trappings of religion that they don't need the church anymore. And so it's kind of trimming the fat. That sounds rude, but I'm not calling human beings the fat. I guess I am. But I mean their approach, that it's trimming things down to a more central core. But the internet also, with all of its information, has exposed a lot of hate and fear-mongering, especially from Christians. And this is where I think I felt the most acute pain as a believer. So when I began to really follow Jesus and profess that out loud, I saw a lot of people who also followed Jesus being total jerks. And it was hard. It was hard for me to associate with people like that, who were hateful, who were fear-mongering. They made problems out of people, and they didn't need to. And then social media and the news exacerbate all of that. If you think about it for just a minute, you'll know what I'm saying. That you turn on the news or scroll through Facebook, and you see hate and fear-mongering everywhere, often associated with Christianity. That's a problem. So, I asked myself a question that I absolutely hate. Can I be honest with you? I hate that question. No, tell me a lie, please. What an ignorant thing to ask. But I said it to myself. I was like, can I be honest with myself? Because things aren't adding up. It's not fitting like it should. And so I made a list of some of the things that didn't add up for me. And I'm wondering if maybe some of these would be problems for you too. Morality, right or wrong ethics. I was deeply bothered by the way the church approached issues of morality, as if every issue in life is just black and white, simple. And if anyone questioned it, they were martyred. I mean, even as of late, someone who says something about, let's just say it, because these are the things that troubled me. Someone that says something about rape victims and abortion. And they just make a post saying, shouldn't we be thinking and praying about the victims of rape when we make these decisions? And then Christians say, crucify him. How could you? There's no room for gray. I'm not saying we should allow abortions. I'm saying we should allow discussions about ethics. But there's no room for thinking or discussing. You agree with me or you're the villain. And that's just one little issue that I know everybody feels is a hot button issue, right? But it's also the day-to-day stuff, like stupid stuff, like alcohol. Not that alcohol is stupid, it can be a deadly thing, but the way some churches became teetotalers, and then the Prohibition era, and then doctrine became adopted by churches that just straight up said all alcohol is evil all the time. And there were plenty of intelligent people who said, are all Big Macs evil all the time? Are all sugary sodas evil all the time? Or, is sitting on the couch evil all the time? No. Ever heard of moderation? But people don't have room to think about that or talk about that. And if they do, if they start to question Well, maybe moderate use is okay if you don't have an addictive personality. If you were to say that out loud, there are places that would shut you down and vilify you. You're not allowed to think or question things. You just do what we tell you. Follow orders. And then the things that I think aren't even up for discussion, like racism, sexism. And if you don't see sexism in the church, it's in this church. Believe it. What about homophobia and Islamophobia? I grew up with gay and Islamic friends in a big city high school. And since moving here to the Bible Belt, I'm in awe of the hate that people feel toward gay people and transgender people and Islamic people and people of any other faith, really. Just the deep resentment and hatred toward other human beings made in the image of God because they haven't followed the same path as you, or no one's led them to the place you're in right now. It's interesting. Denominational arrogance. Maybe this is a preacher's bag, but it does bother me. Just the approach some Christians have toward other Christians, that they're better than the other, that they are the true Christians, and those other people are pseudo-Christians or false. Or worse than that, they're not Christians at all. They're not just kind of Christians, they're not even truly Christian at all. And there are churches that preach that way from the pulpit. If only one denomination is right, God help the world. There are few enough people who profess to be Christian, let alone one sect that gets it right. And then, of course, there's a problem of humans always being wrong about everything. Thanks for laughing, Ron. Again, that one wasn't sarcasm. That was real, but it was supposed to be funny. Doubts about the Bible. Anybody else ever have doubts about the Bible? Get out. No, I'm just kidding. Science. I'm in my 30s, so I grew up in a world that was already post-biblical in the sense that the schools were not teaching Bible. I'm a young person. I was learning Darwinian evolution and things like that. I still believe the Appalachian Mountains are 400 million years old. I think God made them. That doesn't bother me. But it used to. It used to bother me that rock strata could be dated hundreds of millions of years old. And then I would go to church and they said, the world's 6,000 years old. And if anybody tells you different, they're heathens working for the devil. And you laugh, but there's an entire museum many of you paid good money to go to that says that. It's not as funny as you think. Millions of dollars of Christian money used to build that museum to promote an ideology that I don't even believe in, which some of you ask why I've never been. I'm kind of getting upset because I think of how many millions of dollars could have gone to feed the starving or clothe the homeless. But we had to prove that we're right about the age of the earth and remind all the Christians that this is worth fighting over. This is a hill to die on. Or it's at least a hill to build a really big ark on while other people die in the streets. That bothered me. And some of you are thinking, it bothered me too, but I felt scared to ever say it, and he just said it up there. And some of you think, I love the Ark Museum, and I will never come back to this church again. And I'm sorry to hear that. I really am. I'm sorry because I think there are some of you who really thought that just now. What about salvation theories? How people get saved? What's truly the saving power of God? Is it getting baptized? Is it taking communion every week? The Eucharist, the Mass? Is it believing and professing out loud? Is it praying a sinner's prayer? Is it going up front to an altar call? Who's to say? Some of those are biblical. Some of those came hundreds of years later. They're all seemingly good. So which one's right? Who's right? How are people really saved? Do they stay saved? Do they lose their salvation? Free will? Providence? Is God controlling everything? Do I have a choice? Am I a volitional being? What about the afterlife? Everybody thinks they know that heaven and hell are certain places and they know their loved ones are there. They're all in heaven, of course. As George Carlin would say, no one says, my uncle, I bet he's down there screaming up at me right now. No one says that. Is it okay if I'm really blunt? I know I'm offending some of you, but this is the whole point, is that you're not allowed to offend people. You're not allowed to talk about any of this. I think I'm sitting down because I knew I was going to get angry. It is angering. In fact, it's embittering. It makes me mad to think about it now. Because so many of my friends are part of the 92% of millennials that left the church. So many of my friends haven't stepped foot in a church in a decade or more. As soon as their parents quit taking them, they quit going. And it wasn't just time to go to college and explore adulthood. It was, I'm tired of this bigoted system that doesn't allow anyone to ask a question when there's a whole world out there for me to explore and ask all the questions I want. It's idiotic, is what it is. It's fear. Because if you really believe that Jesus is the truth and that the truth will set you free, then you wouldn't be afraid to pursue the truth. If you think you have to protect the truth of Jesus, then you're fooling yourself. If he's true, let him be true and every man a liar, as Paul says. There's no fear in that. Either God is who God says he is and you don't need to be worried about finding out, or you've believed a lie and you're afraid of uncovering it because it's been under the rug so long since you swept it there in your childhood that you don't know what it could have become by now. What about you? I'm assuming you had some hang-ups in your faith. Maybe you are one of those who has just happily followed orders for decades. But if you're like me, then you've had some thoughts that were counter to what you were told. I hope you've countered things I've said. I'm just some idiot sitting up here. I know some things, and I'm wrong about all kinds of stuff. And there are some of you who probably still just believe what I say. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying. I think about that with my own children. Why do I get to raise humans? I make mistakes every day. I'm grateful to be a father, but it's eye-opening. In fact, my reconstruction process really began when I became a father. Until then, I was still deconstructing and felt kind of lost. And then I became a dad, and I'll talk about that next week. But a lot of things changed, and I began to understand God in a new way. But before that happened, before I had kids, and still on occasion, I was an arrogant jerk. And I've come to realize that it was because I wasn't trying to follow Jesus. I was trying to fit into a box created for me by people who claim to be Christian leaders. And when I shoved myself into that box, I didn't fit very well, and I took it out on everybody else. And I made everybody else think they needed to shove themselves into the same box. And if they were unwilling or they complained, then they became the villains. That's a painful way to live. It's a selfish and stupid way to live. So, this ego-driven life that I was living was really ugly. And even though I claimed the name of Jesus, I wasn't sure what I really believed to be true because I had a lot of questions, but I just kept sweeping them under the rug like everybody else. I just pretended I didn't have the questions, or it's just my sinful, deceiving heart. The heart is exceptionally wicked, so deceptive. Who could ever know? Which is just one random verse in the Psalter that everybody loves to quote out of context, by the way. I got to sort of a breaking point, I guess, where my wife told me, "You're just a jerk. You're not nice, and you're arrogant." My mom and sister at times would tell me, "You're awfully arrogant." And enough people who really loved me, without doubt, told me that I finally started to think maybe it's true. You know, at first you think they're all wrong because you're arrogant, so you assume everybody else is wrong. And then you start to think, this is not Christ-like. If I claim to follow Jesus and claim to know about Jesus, then why do I look nothing like Jesus? Am I trying to know the right things about Jesus, or am I trying to be a disciple of Jesus, to follow him, to be in his path? That was a tough question. It was a question that changed my whole life. Anybody ever remodel their home? Yeah, or you've been a part of a remodeling project. It's messy, right? In fact, there may be a room you sort of quarantine everyone out of. And you say, this room is being drywalled right now. There's going to be tons of dust. You tape plastic around the doorways, and you get to work. And then when it's all done, you clean it up, and you roll out the shop vac, and then people can go in that room, and it's usually far prettier than it was before. Maybe structurally more sound than it was before, or the electric is now updated, or whatever. New windows, new flooring, whatever it is. But there is a deconstruction involved, isn't there? It's almost like you have to come to the point where you say, this is okay, we could still live in this space, but it could be so much better if we would just do X, Y, or Z. And then you determine, we will deconstruct what is here in order to make something even better. But you have to choose to do that, and it's costly and sometimes painful. So it is with faith. Yeah, you can just be an elementary level Christian and believe the simple things in black and white that everyone told you when you were a kid, or you can admit that that's probably not all there is to it, and admit that you have your own questions you haven't dealt with, and then you could do the painful work of deconstructing. But it is scary, because some people deconstruct and then they never reconstruct, and they abandon their faith. And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't happen. But at some point, the peril of standing still is greater than moving forward. And I got to that point where if I stayed where I was, the danger was greater than trying to move forward. And so I moved forward. I feel like most of my life, I was trying to follow orders, trying to please everyone around me. I think that's, part of all this was rooted in my own insecurity, to be honest. And following Jesus helps overcome insecurity, by the way. But I couldn't just follow orders anymore. I started thinking, isn't that the excuse Nazis used? I was just doing what I was told. And you could use that excuse if you want to, but the track record doesn't look so good. I was just following orders. At some point, I had to quit. As Braden told me the other day, one of our young men in the church, he said, it's like everybody around is just NPCs, which is video game slang. It means non-playable characters. They're just like the computer-programmed algorithmic characters that just move around and do the same thing over and over again. They're programmed to do something. They're little robots. And he said it sometimes feels like people around us are just NPCs. They just keep doing what they're supposed to do all the time. And then you kind of wake up and you think, oh man, am I a main character? Do I have to make my own choices? And that's scary. It's easier to just be an NPC and do what you're told. But at some point you have to wake up. Now, since some of you don't understand what that is, I thought of an older reference, The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, which is kind of the same thing, right? He wakes up and realizes this is all make-believe. This is just pretense. Sometimes you have to go through that experience. You have to wake up. You have to wake up. And when you wake up and you question who programmed everyone to just do this all the time, or who made these orders, who gave these orders that we're all just blindly following, then you start to ask questions like, why do they get to give the orders? What gives them the authority? How do I know if they're even true or right? And when you ask those questions, your whole life starts to crumble because everything you thought was the foundation is pulled out from underneath you. And I think that's what Jesus meant when he said, build upon the rock. Because when the wind and rains come and you're on the sand, it's going to slide. And God had to tear the foundation out from under me so I could see that it was sand and then reconsider where I wanted to build. Maybe that's happening to some of you. Maybe that's why you're here at this church. But it's a necessary process in order to really fulfill your purpose, I think, as a human, to be the human God made you to be. I think you have to go through this painful process. You have to, at some point, take things apart and look inside, deconstruct. I had to go through it to be a teacher of others, to be a guide, to develop humility and recognize what I really didn't know and what I thought other people knew, and I always wondered, why doesn't it make sense to me? And then you finally realize no one knows, and they're just pretending. And a lot of things that would scare you when you study at high levels, church history and tradition and the Bible. I'm just talking, religious belief. There are things you think, how did I assume everyone just knew this was true? When it sounds like no one has ever really known, and it's just a big mystery. But there's such freedom in mystery when I don't have to know or pretend I know. And freedom is scary. As I've preached before, slavery is easier than freedom. It's certainly not better, but it is easier to simply do what you're told and be given the things you need day by day. And some people think that's what God wants. He wants a bunch of slaves. The word for slave is doulos. Jesus says, no longer do I call you douloi, or slaves, servants, but I call you my friends. Do you know why he says that to them? Because now you know what my Father and I are up to. You understand what we're doing. So you can't just be slaves anymore. He literally says, now that you know, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to just following orders. It's another one of my favorite passages. Paul says, some of you ought to be teachers by now. And we wonder, why aren't they? I look around in this church and I think, why some of you aren't teachers by now? And I think about that a lot. You know, the milk versus solid food, that great analogy. And then I realized it's perhaps because you haven't done it yourself. It's hard to teach others when you haven't questioned anything on your own, when you haven't become educated on your own. How can you then teach others? All you can do is regurgitate what someone else told you. God forbid they simply did that from something that they were told by someone else, and on and on and on. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of churches. People who don't think critically repeating what they heard from someone else who didn't think critically. And once they do that enough times, it's someone's great-great-grandfather or someone who wrote a famous book, and now it's gospel truth. generations later. And it's still as dumb and wrong as it was 100 years ago. But everybody just repeats it enough times that they think it's true. Scary. Hey, Rob, I asked permission to ask him this. You're a jiu-jitsu instructor, the very best in the world, I know. Let me ask you a question, man. Do people ever instruct jiu-jitsu who have never grappled on the mat? Do you think are there any respected jiu-jitsu instructors out there that have never grappled, have never done it at all? Just read a book about it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, yeah, that's what I figured. Philosophy, perhaps. You might find a philosophy professor who's, not really a philosopher. They've just studied enough to be able to teach the content. The same in other educational fields, but there are certain things you can't teach without doing. And I think faith is like that. You can't teach friendship without having a friend. And if faith is closest to friendship with God, then you can't do that without doing it. Does that make sense? You can't do it without doing it. You can't just talk about it. You have to be about it. You have to do it. And I wrestle with that a lot, that maybe the reason some people aren't teachers is because they've never really done it. They don't have a faith of their own, and so they're afraid to teach anyone else because they haven't had their own experience. And I think that was me. In a weird way, that was me. Even at this church early on, I was simply teaching things that I was reading or hearing from other people, and I did it without question. I developed a theology that was arrogant, and I became a person who was more arrogant than I was before. And I really was a jerk. I was teaching, and I shouldn't have been. It was, at best, ineffective, at worst, toxic and harmful. And I regret some of the things I said or did. By God's grace, I'm still here right now. And the road out of that place was not so straightforward. At first, I became angry with people who were just like I was a few years prior. Even in my recent past, my reaction to other people who were simply following orders was anger. How can you be so stupid to just keep believing what somebody told you? How can you not question it? And God said, weren't you doing that just a few years ago? Are you any better than them? And so that took me to a place not of anger, but of pity, which isn't any better. Then I felt sorry for people. Oh, how sad, all these simpletons whose faith has not been developed, those who still just simply do what they're told. How sad. And of course, that's not healthy. And just now, finally, God is leading me to a space where I can talk to you right now about it, to humility, where I recognize that that was a necessary part of the process. You start as children in order to become adults. You have to. You have to. And it's good. In a way that doesn't always make sense to me. It's good. Because it's the way God has designed it. I think that some of the reasons people don't do this are family pressure. So now I'm naming obstacles to faith development, the reason people won't deconstruct their faith. First one, I think, is family pressure. That some of you still feel that if you were to question things that your grandparents and parents were so certain of, that it's like questioning your grandparents and parents themselves. Because we attach beliefs to people. So that if you question what they believed, you've questioned them as human beings, their love, their authority in your life, whatever else. If we could detach those and simply examine truth and still love people, it would help. But there is family pressure, and some are pressured when they ask questions to shut up about it and quit asking questions. Any of you, if you be honest, any of you ever asked critical questions when you were younger in the church and felt like an adult in your life told you to not ask that, or we don't know the answers, don't ask that anymore? Something along those lines? Wow. I was afraid of that. Over half of you just raised your hands. And if we had the Farm Festival people here too, I bet half of them would have raised their hands. But they're eating sausage right now. It was getting dark. I had to do something silly. Okay. Second thing, I wrote down 4 things. Second obstacle is community ostracism. It's much like the family pressure, but in this case, it's your church community, especially if you are in a rigid denomination. As soon as you question something, you're pushed out. Even if you're right and they're wrong, it doesn't matter. You have offended their sensibilities. You have questioned their authority. They have conflated those two things, seeking truth and loving a person and respecting a person. They've conflated those so that if you are seeking truth against someone that said something else, you don't love that person. If your new truth doesn't line up with what they said, then you don't care about them or you don't respect them. And that's creating enmity in all kinds of churches, and it pushes people out. Sometimes literally people are excommunicated or driven out of their churches. Then you have the self-doubt, and this has been one of my hardest to cope with. I've mostly been involved with Christians who were pretty understanding. Even this church has kept me for almost a decade now, 9.5 years, and you know how crazy I am, and you still let me sit up here, swiveling all morning. But my hardest critic is me. It hasn't really been other Christians pushing back. I think most Christians are afraid to push back against a pastor, especially around here. So my critic is in here. It's the other me that says, are you sure? Are you really willing to go there or risk that or question that? What would that mean for all these other things that are connective tissue there? It's tough. It is untangling. We say deconstructing, but it's untangling. It's like tentacles all through my faith, and if I pull one thing, it's like ripping all this other stuff out by accident. It's scary. And so I doubt myself and my ability to even understand. And then the purging fire. God knows you need to grow, but you don't want to go through the process that's painful. It's purging to eliminate childishness, selfishness, pettiness from your life. To be like Christ is a painful growing process. There are growing pains involved. Patient, persistent grace. God's enduring love. That God would put up with immature kids because God wants to see them grow. And God will help them to grow. It's always been God's grace. I thought I could see. And then God showed me, you just see walking trees. You're the most dangerous kind of person. At least the blind man doesn't get behind the wheel. But you think you can see, and you've now endangered everyone else on the road. Jesus said that, didn't he? The blind leading the blind. Some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, he led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? What if he looked up and said, I can see? And that was the end of the story. What if he had been even a little bit dishonest with Jesus? Jesus had just healed him. It probably felt ungrateful to say, I need more. But in his honesty, he said, I see, but it's still not quite right. I see like trees moving around instead of people. And because of his honesty, Jesus touched him a second time. I think that's my story. That when I finally said to Jesus, I see, but I still don't see clearly. He said, thank you for admitting that. Now let me help you. Maybe that's what's happening in your life. My kids, when they put the magnets back together, often what they build is better than the thing they had built before. Every time they rebuild, they're learning and getting better and better at it. That's a cool thing to watch. But as a dad, I don't really care. But honestly, I don't care that much about magnets. But I also don't care when it gets knocked over and they come to me and say, oh, I say, it's fine. Do you know why I don't care? Because they're just magnets. And in my brain, I know whatever happens to the magnets, there will still be a 100-year-old hardwood floor there that they can build whatever they want to on. That hasn't moved. That's not shaking. It's not going anywhere. And the key to deconstructing faith is to find that foundation. It's to find the thing that allows you to say about everything else, I don't really care anymore, because this is never going to move. I hope you have found that foundation.